I booked the Airbnb because it was close to a slot canyon I had been scouting for weeks. I wanted to shoot at sunrise, the way the light pooled in the narrows just after the first rays hit the rim. The place itself was a trailer, parked alone in the desert, miles from anything. No neighbors, no fences, no streetlights. The GPS coordinates led me down a gravel track that disappeared into red dust and sagebrush, twisting around low mesas until I finally saw the trailer, pale against the deepening orange of the horizon. It was smaller than I expected, a single aluminum shell with faded paint and a single window that faced the canyon. I parked, unloaded my gear, and walked around the trailer once, trying to take in the isolation. The silence was absolute, thick, almost tactile. Inside, the trailer smelled of cleaning solvents and the faint tang of metal. The floor creaked slightly with each step, and the thin walls barely muffled the wind outside. There was a small bed against the back wall, a kitchenette with a propane stove, and a tiny bathroom. Nothing was out of place. Everything seemed basic, but functional. I set up my camera equipment on the table, checked the lenses, and tried to convince myself that the desert quiet was peaceful. I wanted to shoot until the sun dipped fully behind the mesas, then wake before dawn. That was the plan. The first hours passed without incident. Night fell quickly. The sky turned deep indigo, stars bright against blackness. The wind picked up, rattling the aluminum siding. Somewhere far off, a coyote yipped. I settled on the bed, trying to sleep with earplugs, telling myself the desert was empty, that nothing would come near. I checked the window lock twice. I double-checked the trailer door. The isolation was absolute, or so I thought. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. Sharp, quick, and unmistakable. The click of a camera shutter. I froze. My camera was on the table. I had not taken a single photo since dusk. The sound came again, precise, perfectly timed. Click, pause, click. Same interval as my own shutter when I had been practicing earlier in the day. Same pitch. My stomach tightened. I rolled onto my side and listened. The shutter clicks came from outside, from the darkness surrounding the trailer. Slow, methodical, mimicking the way I had been shooting the canyon walls hours before. I didn't move. I didn't want to know. I tried to rationalize it. Could it be the wind? Could rocks falling in the distance create a similar sound? But the timing was exact. The pause between each click matched my own rhythm. My heart pounded. I stayed in bed until the noise stopped, and then, when I thought it was over, I heard it again. Click, pause, click. Each time, I felt the desert air vibrate with presence. My mind raced, calculating the distance from the trailer. The clicks were close enough that someone, or something, was circling, moving around the trailer while staying just out of sight. I didn't leave the trailer for the rest of the night. I didn't look out the window. I didn't check the locks. I stayed on the bed, sweat cooling in the dry air, every muscle tense. The wind continued to shake the siding. The stars shifted imperceptibly across the sky, and the darkness felt almost tangible. Time slowed. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that my mind had played tricks in the emptiness of the desert. But I knew the clicks were real. When daylight came, the sun crested the horizon and spilled gold over the red dust. I forced myself to move, heart still racing, and stepped outside. The desert was calm. The wind had died down, and the sky was clear. I followed the perimeter of the trailer, inspecting the ground. That's when I saw the footprints. At first, they looked like standard boots, circling the trailer from the edge of the door around to the back. Then, halfway through the circle, the shape changed. The heel marks disappeared. The imprints elongated. It looked as if someone had risen from crouch or crawl to full height. The stride altered subtly. The depth of the prints shifted. I followed them in the dust, tracing the full circle, and then they stopped at the edge of the gravel road, leading away from the trailer. I didn't touch my camera gear. I didn't try to follow the tracks. I packed quickly and left. The sunrise shots I had planned never happened. The canyon was bathed in perfect light, inaccessible to me because I was trapped in fear for a single night. The isolation that had seemed like a selling point was now its own threat. The desert had concealed a presence, allowed it to track, observe, and disappear without confrontation. I drove slowly back toward the main road, eyes constantly scanning the desert, still expecting movement at the edge of my vision. By the time I reached a paved highway, the adrenaline finally faded, leaving a hollow weight in my chest. The trailer disappeared behind the rise of the mesa, pale and silent, as though it had never existed. I didn't call the host. I didn't explain. There was no need. I had been alone, observed, and left without incident. The experience remained with me in a clear, tangible way. The perfect mimicry of my own camera, the methodical circling, the footprints that changed as if the observer had shifted posture, all of it was precise, human, and entirely believable. I never went back to that area. I never photographed that canyon. I avoided isolated rentals afterward, especially those with no neighbors or fences. The ending was simple. I survived the night. I left before sunrise. The desert and the trailer remained exactly as they had been, silent, empty, and impossible to understand fully. But the impression of that night stayed, sharply detailed, embedded in my memory. The careful mimicry, the shifting footprints, and the quiet reminder that in isolation, someone or something can observe without ever revealing itself. I booked the place because it was cheap and far from everything. Northern Arizona in late October felt like a clean break. I had just quit my job in Flagstaff after months of dragging myself through shifts I hated, and I wanted 2 quiet nights before driving east to stay with my sister. The listing showed a small converted hunting cabin an hour down a dirt road, surrounded by pines and open ground. It was described as off-grid and isolated, with propane lights and no service. That was exactly what I wanted. Silence without notifications. No people. The host only mentioned elk and coyotes. Nothing about neighbors. Nothing about hunters. Nothing about anyone else. The drive out took longer than expected. The dirt road narrowed and climbed, turning rocky in places. Tire ruts cut deep into the ground. I passed old fence posts and rusted gates that no longer blocked anything. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was already low, slanting through the trees and turning the dust gold. I parked beside the structure at around 4:40 p.m. The cabin was smaller than the photos suggested. A single room with a low roof, gray wood walls, and a small porch. No other buildings nearby. No tracks from recent vehicles. The place felt left behind. When I opened the door, the smell hit me first. Old leather, wood smoke, cold metal. It smelled lived in, even though the listing said it was only used occasionally. There was no fire going. The stove was cold. The air inside felt heavy, like it had been sealed for a while. I dropped my bag and did a quick walk around before dark. That was when I noticed the boot prints. They were pressed into the dirt around the cabin in a loose circle. Not random, not passing through. They looped around the structure, wide arcs, never close to the door. The size stood out, much larger than mine. Deep heel marks. The tread looked sharp, not worn smooth. They were not fresh enough to crumble under my step, but not old enough to be softened by weather either. I told myself it was the host or a previous guest. Hunters used the area. That made sense. I did not want to start the trip with fear, so I forced it down. Inside, the cabin was basic. A cot against one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf with canned food left behind, all expired. Propane lanterns hung from hooks. The windows were small and cloudy, framed by thick wood. I checked the latch on the door. It held. As night settled, the temperature dropped fast. The wind moved through the trees in low waves. I lit one lantern and cooked a simple meal. The quiet felt deep but not peaceful. Every sound carried. Branches shifting, distant yips. The floor creaked when I moved. I turned in early. I wanted to be rested for the drive the next day. The lantern stayed on low. I lay on the cot in my clothes, boots by my side, listening to the land settle. Sometime after full dark, I became aware of movement outside. Not footsteps, not pacing. It sounded like weight shifting slowly. Careful, as if someone was adjusting their stance again and again. The sound came from the side of the cabin with the windows. Then something brushed the frame. Not a scrape. A soft, controlled contact high up, higher than an elk's shoulder. The frame creaked slightly with answering pressure. I froze. My breathing slowed without me deciding to slow it. I listened hard. There was another shift of weight. A pause. Then breathing. It did not sound rushed or wild. It was steady, even, close. I did not move. The lantern hummed faintly. My heart beat hard, but I kept still. The breathing stayed for a long time. It moved once, just enough to brush the window again, then it stopped. At some point, the sounds faded. I did not hear steps leaving, just absence. I lay there until my body cramped and my mouth went dry. Sleep did not come. When the sky finally lightened, I was already awake. Morning showed the cabin clearly. I stepped outside and circled it again. The boot prints were clearer in daylight. They overlapped in places, as if someone had stood there for a while. Near the window, the ground was pressed flat. The height made sense now. Whoever had been standing close, leaning in. I checked the propane tank before making coffee. The valve was turned off, fully closed. I know I had not touched it. I had checked it the night before without changing it. That was when I packed. I did not rush in a panic, but I moved with purpose. Everything went back into my bag. I did not eat. I did not sit down. I kept my eyes on the tree line as I loaded the car. Before leaving, I walked farther out than before, following the faint trail behind the cabin. Less than 100 yards in, I found a flattened area under the trees. A crude spot. No fire ring. No trash. Just disturbed ground, pressed leaves, and a dark stain that looked old. Nearby were more boot prints, the same size, leading off toward a ridge. I drove out before noon. The road felt longer on the way back. Every bump made me flinch. When I reached a point with service, I checked the listing again. I messaged the host and asked if anyone else had rented the place that month. Later that day, I got a response. No one else had stayed there in weeks. The host said they sometimes checked the property but had not been out recently. No mention of other people. I did not ask for a refund. I did not go back. Months later, after I had settled elsewhere, I looked into the area out of a need to make sense of it. The land around the cabin bordered a stretch of public forest that was popular during hunting season. Not for elk at that time, but for deer and small game. I found old forum posts from hunters talking about using abandoned cabins as landmarks, not shelters. I learned about people who camped illegally on private land during season, keeping spots hidden to avoid competition. The pieces fit together in a way that made my stomach tighten. Someone had been using the area as a base, not living in the cabin, but nearby, watching it, keeping track of when it was empty. The boot prints circling the structure were not random. They were checks. The smell inside was from someone spending time there when no one was booked, airing out gear, using the space without staying overnight. That night, they came back out of habit or curiosity. They saw a car where there should not have been one. They approached slowly, careful not to be heard. They leaned in to see who had arrived. They listened to me breathe while deciding what to do. Turning off the propane was not a mistake. It was a test or a message, a way to see if I would notice, a way to remind me I was not alone out there. I had interrupted someone's routine, someone who knew the land, the road, the sounds, someone tall enough to brush the window without effort. Leaving early was the only reason nothing worse happened. The cabin was isolated, but it was not empty. It belonged to the listing on paper, but in practice it was being watched. And for one night, so was I. I needed a place close to the hospital. My sister had an outpatient procedure early in the morning, and hotels nearby were either booked or outrageously expensive. I found a basement Airbnb in a quiet New Jersey suburb. The listing promised privacy, soundproofing, and convenience. The photos showed a finished space with neutral walls, a low ceiling, and a small kitchenette tucked into one corner. It looked like it had been recently renovated. The host lived upstairs, but assured in writing that we would never hear each other. That was the main appeal. I wanted peace, and I wanted to focus on my sister's recovery without worrying about neighbors, traffic, or noise. The drive that was uneventful. The street was narrow and lined with modest single-family homes. Some had lawns carefully trimmed. Others had overgrown bushes that shaded cracked sidewalks. The house itself looked normal, the kind of place you'd expect in a suburb where people knew each other by first name but rarely crossed paths. I parked in the driveway and took a moment to look at the front door. Nothing seemed off. I didn't think twice about the basement below. The basement entrance was a set of wooden stairs behind the side door. The air felt cooler as I stepped down. The space was clean, almost too clean. Walls freshly painted, carpet vacuumed, the furniture arranged with precise care. The ceiling was low, and I had to stoop slightly to walk across the main area. There were no windows. The only source of natural light would have been a thin strip at the top of the door if left open, but otherwise the basement was sealed from the outside world. The first night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The host's promise of privacy seemed accurate. I unpacked our things and tried to settle my mind. I had grown used to my sister's presence, but she needed rest, and I wanted to stay alert in case of any complications after her surgery. Around 10, I turned off the kitchen lights and sat on the small sofa, reading. The low hum of the air conditioning, or what I thought was air conditioning, was the only sound. Then I noticed it. The vents on the wall were decorative. The metal grates were clean, painted the same white as the walls, but when I leaned closer, I realized there was no airflow. No ducts behind the grill. I pressed gently. Nothing moved. The vents didn't connect to anything. Yet, there was a sound coming from them. A soft, slow exhale that was human. Not loud, not sharp, just consistent. Regular, like someone breathing through a mouthpiece, close but careful. I froze. I waited. The sound stopped when I turned off the light. When I turned it back on, it started again. The pattern repeated with each flick of the switch. My stomach tightened. I checked the entire room. No loose panels. No hidden spaces large enough to conceal a person. The basement was small. It didn't make sense. I left the lights on and stayed awake until the hours blurred. I tried to convince myself it was a draft or the pipes. But there was no pipe rattling, no shift in temperature, nothing that could mimic the deliberate rise and fall of breathing. The sound ended when the lights went off. That alone made no sense in mechanical terms. No central system would respond to a light switch in that way. Morning brought sunlight only from the doorway at the top of the stairs. I told myself it had been a bad night and that I was overthinking things. The space was secure. The door locked properly. My sister slept peacefully, as if nothing had occurred. I went upstairs to take out the trash and check on water in the kitchen, looking around casually. The host's apartment looked normal. There was no indication of anything unusual. I tried to put it behind me. The second night, I stayed alert. My sister's procedure went smoothly, and she returned to the basement with the host's instructions to rest. I watched her lie down on the sofa, adjusted the blanket over her shoulders, and sat near the small table with my laptop. The basement felt tighter than before. I couldn't shake the awareness that the vents were fake. I thought about what the breathing had sounded like. Controlled, patient, observant. I noticed the smoke detector in the corner above the kitchenette. Something about it struck me as odd, a little too clean, too centered. I got a flashlight and leaned in. Behind the white plastic cover was a small lens. A tiny camera, black and unmarked, angled toward the main living area. Not wired into anything obvious. I looked at the breaker box upstairs. The basement wasn't on a separate line. No outlets seemed tampered with. Nothing to power it externally. Whoever installed it had clearly accounted for that, hiding the device without drawing attention. The realization hit me fully. I wasn't alone. Someone had access, had watched. The vent breathing, the controlled rhythm. It had not been imagination. I didn't stay to investigate further. I woke my sister gently, gathered our things in silence, and left the house before 3 in the morning. The street was dark and empty. I made sure the car doors locked behind me. Every creak of the pavement under the tires felt loud. We drove in silence to the nearest hotel with a lobby still staffed at that hour. I called the local police to report the camera, gave the address, and explained what we found. They said they would check, but advised caution if we returned. I didn't plan to. By morning, the Airbnb listing was gone. Not deactivated, not unavailable. Gone entirely. All traces removed. I checked the host profile. It no longer existed. I tried to read reviews, posts, anything. Only cached pages remained, showing the same basement images. No mention of previous incidents. Nothing. Whoever ran the listing had vanished as quietly as they had appeared. It became clear afterward what likely happened. The host was not interested in hospitality. The basement was a controlled space, meant to conceal observation. The vents were faked to hide the presence of a watcher. The camera, placed to see without being noticed, and a low ceiling and windowless design kept the space isolated. It was private, all right, but not for guests. The basement was a trap, disguised as comfort. We never returned. I never saw the host again. The address was erased from the platform. The listing disappeared. I later discovered others in the area had similar experiences with short-term rentals vanishing without trace. It wasn't supernatural, just someone exploiting the system with careful planning, understanding human trust, and quiet timing. We were lucky to notice the signs before it escalated. The fear was real, grounded, and entirely human. A stranger using a place meant for safety as a way to observe and control. I carry that awareness whenever I book short-term rentals now. The basement experience left a clear memory. The sound of measured breathing through a fake vent, the black lens of the hidden camera, the way the light seemed to trigger observation. All of it taught me to check, always check, and to trust instinct over appearances. The horror was not fantastical, but it was undeniable, and the ending was as complete as it could be. We left unharmed, but fully aware that someone had invaded our privacy in the most deliberate way possible. I was driving north on Highway 101 when a storm hit. Rain came down in sheets, the kind that makes asphalt shine like glass and turns every reflector into a blur. My car hydroplaned once, twice, and finally gave up halfway up a steep curve. I pulled over as best I could, checking the phone for signal. Nothing. Not a bar. Not a flicker. The storm sounded like a living thing, slapping against the windshield, howling through the gaps in the doors. I knew staying in the car wasn't safe. The shoulder was narrow, the cliff edge not far. I remembered seeing a small house tucked into the rock half a mile back. On a hunch, I retraced my steps and knocked on the door. The host answered almost immediately. He was pale, drenched, and avoided eye contact. He offered the room for the night and waved me in. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to. The house was a strange hybrid of concrete and wood, built directly into the cliff face. The concrete walls were raw and cold, the wood sections weathered and swollen from the damp. The windows were thick, but the wind rattled them violently, making the glass vibrate with each gust. From the bedroom window, I could see the ocean, dark and furious, waves smashing against the rocks far below. The smell of salt, rain, and damp would fill the air. The house was quiet, apart from the storm, and yet it felt oddly closed in, like it had been carved out of the rock for the sole purpose of keeping people inside. The bedroom was small, rectangular, with a low ceiling and a mattress pressed against the far wall. The door didn't latch. I tried it once, and the gap made it clear that even a gentle push would swing it open. I wedged a chair under the handle to keep it closed. It didn't feel secure, but it was better than nothing. I unpacked what I had, setting the bag against the wall, and tried to settle in. The room smelled of concrete dust and damp wood. I could hear the wind screaming outside, rattling the wooden panels like a warning. I lay down, listening to the storm. Sleep didn't come easily. Every gust sounded like the house itself was shivering. Around 2 in the morning, I felt the mattress shift. It was subtle at first, almost like settling, but it continued. Slowly, like weight being added inch by inch. I froze. The mattress moved under me, shifting gently, deliberately. The floor didn't creak, the walls didn't groan. The air smelled metallic, sharp, biting at my nostrils. I couldn't move. I wasn't asleep. My body refused to respond. I tried to lift my arm, to roll over, but it was as if something had settled across my chest. Not heavy, just impossibly still. I lay there, wide awake, listening to my own heartbeat and the wind outside. Time seemed to stretch. The mattress stopped shifting after what felt like an hour, though it was likely less. I didn't breathe until I was sure the movement had ended. By then, the room felt colder, tighter, like the air had weight. Morning came slowly, pale light through the dirty windows. The storm had passed, leaving a wet wind and drizzle. I got out of bed and noticed the floor. There were footprints, damp and small, leading from the side of the bed to the bathroom. They stopped abruptly at the drain. No trail continued out, no prints leading to the door, no wet footprints elsewhere. They were mine in size, but not mine in origin. I had been careful getting out of bed, barefoot, placing my feet precisely on the carpet. These prints didn't match. They were slightly smudged in a way that suggested movement under pressure, not a simple step. I inspected the mattress. It had indentations, but nothing unusual beyond the pressure that had made it feel as if someone had been there. I checked the rest of the floor. Dry, clean, no sign of entry or exit. No puddles, no tools, no towels that could have caused the moisture. I dressed quickly and went upstairs. The host was nowhere to be seen. I left a note asking about the prints and the mattress, but received no reply. Hours passed. Messages went unanswered. The house was empty, and I had no reason to linger. I drove slowly back down the cliff road, careful on the wet asphalt, replaying the night in my mind. Every detail felt concrete, every sensation deliberate. The mattress shift, the metallic air, the precise footprints leading only to the drain. Nothing could explain it naturally, and yet it had to be something human, some oddity of the house I didn't understand. Maybe a plumbing leak, maybe condensation from the storm collected under the bed, maybe some quirk of the foundation. Nothing could recreate the precise feeling of weight moving under me while I lay awake, unable to respond. Weeks later, I checked online. The Airbnb listing still existed, but the host had deactivated messaging. Other listings in the area had reviews mentioning structural oddities, low ceilings, and strange noises, but nothing like my experience. It occurred to me that the house itself could be the culprit, its design forcing sounds and movements in ways that made human perception unreliable. I convinced myself this was the only rational explanation. The storm, the design, the metal and concrete shifting, water dripping in hidden channels. There was no one else, no deliberate intrusion. That alone made it unsettling. Human error, architectural peculiarity, and natural forces had conspired to make one night feel entirely unsafe. I never stayed in a cliffside Airbnb again. The memory of the storm, the mattress, and the metallic air remains vivid. The ending is simple and complete. We survived, left safely, and the host never responded. There was no confrontation needed, no explanation offered. The house itself had created a scenario that was perfectly believable, perfectly human in every sense, and perfectly terrifying. I drove away in the morning rain, the ocean still crashing below, convinced that some nights are best survived rather than understood. We found a farmhouse by accident. We were backpacking through Eastern Europe, broke, tired, and desperately looking for anywhere to sleep that night. The village name was impossible to pronounce, and we never tried. The Airbnb listing had one photo, grainy, showing the corner of a roof and part of a wooden wall, and no reviews. None of us had high expectations, and that was exactly why we booked it. The image suggested a place with a roof over our heads and walls to keep the wind out. The reality was far more than we anticipated. The road leading to the house was narrower than the map indicated, winding through fields and low hills. It had cracks, potholes, and scattered gravel. We carried our packs along the final stretch because the car could not make it over the ruts. By the time we reached the property, the sun was low, casting long shadows across an uneven yard. The farmhouse was older than the road. Its wood had faded to gray, warped in some areas, and the roof sagged slightly at one corner. The barn beside it had a heavy wooden door wired shut from the outside. I could see rusted staples and thick cord straining to hold it fast. Whoever had closed it wanted it secure. That much was obvious. There were no other buildings nearby, just a trailing half a football field away and open field stretching beyond. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of dust, old wood, and something sour I couldn't place. The floors creaked under every step. The walls were pale and uneven, plaster flaking in places. What caught my attention immediately were the carved notches. They were shoulder height, identical in size, and spaced with precise regularity across nearly every wall. I ran my hand over one. The edges were smooth, as if worn over decades, but deliberate. There were too many of them to count quickly, covering hallways and door frames, the corners of rooms, even the edges of cupboards. None of us knew what to make of it. None of us had asked. We didn't question it much either. We were tired, eager to rest, and the farmhouse offered more shelter than we had expected. The night was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you can hear the rhythm of your own breathing. Wind moved through cracks in the wood, moaning gently, rustling dry leaves outside. We settled into the main room, spreading our sleeping bags across the floor. The barn loomed to the side, dark and silent. A sliver of moonlight outlined the treeline beyond. That was when the movement started. It was subtle at first, small shadows crossing the edge of the field. Something moved between the barn and the treeline, always along the same path. No sound came with it. No brush of leaves, no breaking of twigs. It wasn't fast. It walked, or moved in a way that resembled walking deliberately and consistently. Each time it passed, we froze. None of us spoke. Our instincts screamed at us to retreat, but curiosity kept us still. We watched for hours. The pattern repeated hour after hour, shadow crossing the same stretch between barn and trees, never deviating, never coming closer. Every time, it seemed exactly the same size, exactly the same shape. I don't remember ever deciding to look. Our eyes just caught it in the corner of the window or the doorway. Eventually, it got to the point where watching it became unbearable. Our minds tried to fill in the blank spaces. Shapes and sizes, features, forms. Each time, we stopped ourselves from saying anything, from discussing it, from assigning any description to it. There was a kind of collective silence, a tacit agreement not to define what we were seeing. None of us could breathe properly. The farmhouse itself seemed to close in around us. The wood groaned under the wind, the notches in the walls catching the weak light from our flashlights. Everything felt exaggerated, focused, alive in a way that made our own presence heavy. By dawn, we were exhausted. The air smelled damp, old, and sharp from the long night. We hadn't slept. The pattern of movement outside hadn't changed. Whatever it was, it had been patient, repeating the same route until the first light. We were frozen, caught between wanting to run and knowing the safest place we could be was inside. Then the host appeared. He came silently, seemingly from the treeline, though I can't say how. His presence was calm, authoritative, and oddly detached. He looked at us, avoided our eyes, and gestured toward the door. No words were needed. He didn't ask for payment. He didn't explain. He didn't linger. We left immediately, still unsure what we had been watching or why he had arrived. We walked down the dirt path together, our backpacks heavier than usual. None of us spoke. We didn't discuss shapes or forms or shadows. It wasn't fear of ridicule. It was recognition that naming it would change it, would make it real in a way we weren't ready to acknowledge. Even months later, none of us have said aloud what we thought it looked like. The farmhouse faded behind us as the village disappeared from view, swallowed by fields and mist. The barn remained wired shut, the notches carved into the walls, and the treeline remained unchanged. The ending is simple and complete. The host never returned our calls. We never received any charges. We survived the night without incident, but the memory stayed. It is sharp, immediate, and personal. The farmhouse was older than the road, its carvings deliberate, its surrounding land waiting for something we couldn't define. The movement outside repeated as if the land itself had a rhythm. We were trespassers by accident, witnesses by misfortune, and released by the host's intervention. Nothing more happened, nothing needed to. The experience remained a singular, unexplainable event, one we carry quietly, a reminder that some places are patient, observant, and entirely real, and that sometimes the most terrifying experiences require no words to confirm their presence. I rented the studio because it was convenient. I had a job interview the next morning, and the building was within walking distance of the office. One night, nothing more, I told myself. The listing promised a high-rise unit with a keypad entry, a small but efficient space, and a city view. The photos were minimal, showing a bed, a kitchenette, and a window stretching along one wall. I didn't expect comfort. I expected functionality. The building was modern, glass and steel, lights reflecting off the wet streets below. The lobby smelled of polished floors and disinfectant. The keypad at the entrance was illuminated, the numbers glowing evenly. I punched in the code, the lock clicked, and the door swung open. Inside the studio, everything was exactly as advertised. A narrow hallway led to the kitchenette and the bathroom. The bed was pressed against one wall. The window was high, overlooking the city grid, lights sparkling in uneven patterns and rain slicking the streets. At first, nothing felt off. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional elevator ping. I unpacked minimally, leaving my bag against the wall, and went through my usual routine. The kitchenette was clean, the fridge empty except for a few bottles of water. The thermostat worked. There were enough towels, sheets, and toiletries for one night. It was in the bathroom that I first noticed something strange. The mirror above the sink had long scratches, not on the surface. On the inside, I ran my finger across them. Smooth glass. The lines were beneath the reflective coating, faintly curved, pressed into the silver layer. I tried to trace them with my eyes. They followed no pattern I could recognize. They weren't random. They weren't minor chips from wear. They looked like something had pressed from behind the glass over and over, deliberately, slowly. My heart rate increased, but I tried to rationalize. Maybe the mirror was old, poorly manufactured, and the silvering had shifted over time. Maybe the previous guest had been careless. But the scratches were too precise, too deliberate. I left the light on that night. The city below flickered with headlights, street lamps, and neon signs. The wind rattled faintly against the windows, though the building's structure minimized vibration. I lay on the bed, trying to focus on breathing, trying to ignore the unease settling in my chest. I checked the lock on the door, triple-checked the keypad, and made sure the deadbolt was engaged. Everything was as it should be. Around midnight, I heard it. The keypad at the building entrance beeped once. I froze. Then after a pause, it beeped again, and again. Slow, methodical, each press deliberate, precise. Not a continuous sequence like someone fumbling with the code, not quick and frantic like an emergency. Just steady, consistent attempts. I counted 8 beeps before I stopped, then paused, then 3 more. The rhythm suggested patience, observation, intent. I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The hum of the city mixed with the occasional beep. Every time I strained to hear, it became sharper, more purposeful. I tried to imagine someone outside, working the keypad, perhaps assuming I was asleep, perhaps testing the lock, checking the door. The thought of them pressing each number slowly, knowing what they were doing, was worse than imagining a brute force attempt. There was intention in the pace. By 2 a.m., I was awake, restless, hyper-aware of every creak in the floorboards, every hum from the ventilation, every reflection in the mirror. The scratches in the bathroom returned to my mind. Not random, pressed from behind, deliberate. And now, outside, the beeps continued sporadically. I didn't call anyone. I didn't check the door. I didn't move. I just stayed on the bed, still, waiting for something to happen that never did. The night stretched endlessly. Morning arrived slowly, the city light changing from cool blues to the pale gray of dawn. I didn't wait for the interview. I dressed quietly, left the apartment, and walked down the corridor to the elevator. The lobby was empty. The keypad was quiet, inactive, as though nothing had occurred. I didn't speak to anyone. I took the stairs instead of the elevator. My footsteps echoed in the stairwell, a sharp contrast to the silent tension of the night. Outside, the streets were wet from rain, early commuters hurrying past, oblivious to anything unusual. I didn't stop to look back at the building. I walked to a nearby cafe to regroup, to calm my pulse, and eventually took a taxi to the office. I went to the interview as if nothing had happened, but the scratches and the methodical keypad attempts replayed in my mind with every detail intact. Later, the host messaged me. asking why I had checked out before sunrise. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. I couldn't explain the unease, the metallic scent of tension that had filled the air in the studio, the deliberate scratches in the mirror, the patient rhythm of the keypad. I didn't need to. No evidence existed beyond my memory. I never booked a studio with a keypad entrance again. I avoided listings that looked too modern, too clean, or too isolated. The city continued around me, unaware, indifferent. The scratches in the mirror and the beeps from the keypad remained real in my mind. There was no confrontation, no physical presence inside the apartment, no harm done beyond fear and hyper-awareness. That was enough. The ending is clear. I left. I survived the night. Nothing followed me. Nothing escalated, but the impression remained. The scratches, the beeps, the calculated patience of someone outside, trying codes. All were tangible, entirely human, and completely unnerving. I never told the host what I had experienced. The story ended the moment I stepped onto the street, but the memory has stayed. I remember every detail because it was precise, deliberate, and undeniable. I knew the apartment had not been broken into, and yet it had been occupied, observed, tested in subtle ways I could not ignore. That is the horror of it. Real, deliberate, and entirely human. We wanted isolation. That was the point. The listing promised it. A small stone cottage on the edge of a loch, tucked into a copse of pines, with no roads nearby and nothing but open water and heather stretching into the hills. We were coming from a week of city noise, fluorescent lights, and crowds, and we wanted silence, space, and time to ourselves. The directions led us down a narrow gravel track, winding past moss-covered stone walls and occasional sheep, until the loch appeared through the trees. The cottage was smaller than the photo suggested, gray stone weathered dark by rain, a steep roof of slate, and a single chimney curling smoke even though we had arrived too early for the host to have lit a fire. It was the kind of place that seemed to have grown out of the landscape itself, not built onto it. We parked and approached on foot, carrying our bags over the damp grass. The air smelled of wet stone and pine. The loch was still, its surface like glass, reflecting the clouds and the gray hills behind. The cottage felt utterly alone. No other buildings, no lights, no passing cars. It was quiet, impossibly quiet. Even the wind seemed absorbed somehow, muffled against the stone walls. That silence was the first thing that unsettled me. Not noise, not movement, but absence. The way the air held itself, as if waiting. Inside, the cottage was simple. A small living area with a fireplace, a kitchenette, and a single bedroom. The walls were thick, the floor uneven stone in places, polished wood elsewhere. Everything smelled faintly of the loch outside, damp and cold, and of old smoke, probably from the host's occasional fires. We unpacked, prepared a light dinner, and tried to settle in. The silence continued, pressing against us in the corners, the empty spaces between furniture, the unlit windows. Night fell faster than I expected, and with it, the sense of being utterly alone sharpened. At first, I thought the quiet was peaceful. By the time we had gone to bed, it felt heavy. The loch outside was black, the hills beyond silhouetted, the only sounds our own breathing. Then it began, a soft, deliberate pressing against the outer wall. Not knocks, not bumps from wildlife. Presses spaced evenly, methodical, like someone testing the stones themselves. I lay in bed, watching the shadowed wall through the small window beside the bed. Each press moved the masonry slightly, just enough to be noticed. The pattern repeated at regular intervals, always the same, no variation, no hesitation. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe wind caught something lodged against the stones. Maybe a branch or an animal. But the presses were too steady, too deliberate. They didn't scatter or bounce. They were measured. I counted them mentally. 1, 2, 3, pause, 1, 2, 3, over and over. My heart beat faster, and I realized I was gripping the sheets. The cottage seemed to hold its breath with me. Every time my eyes adjusted to the darkness, the stones looked the same, unmoving, until the next press. Eventually, I got up and switched on the lights. The pressing stopped immediately. Complete silence returned, as though the presence had vanished under illumination. I sat on the bed, staring at the walls, trying to convince myself it was imagination or fatigue. Every shadow, every irregularity in the stone now seemed sharp and distinct, revealing nothing but cold masonry. I forced myself to lie down again, leaving the lights on. I couldn't sleep, but I felt safer knowing that whatever had been testing the wall no longer moved. The morning arrived pale and gray. Mist hovered over the lock, curling around the tree line. We walked outside, coffee in hand, and inspected the walls. That's when I saw the smudges. Hand-shaped marks, higher than my head, pressed into the stone. Not scratches, not chalk, but smears, almost as though someone had leaned against the wall deliberately. The impressions were faint in the early light, but unmistakable. 5 fingers palm, repeated along the side of the house where the presses had come from the night before. I measured them roughly against myself. No one in our group could have left marks that high. We circled the cottage, looking for footprints or other signs. The grass was wet from dew, the ground soft in places, but nothing else appeared. No tire tracks, no shoe prints, no tools. Nothing that explained the hand-shaped smudges. The stones themselves were weathered and cold. The cottage, which had seemed part of the landscape, now felt like a deliberate presence watching us, testing boundaries, retreating when challenged. We left the lights on as we packed the car. Every glance back at the cottage felt heavier, as if it were waiting for us to close the door. The host appeared later that morning, walking down the gravel track from the opposite direction. He seemed normal, polite, and distant, and we didn't mention the night or the marks. He didn't ask, and we didn't volunteer. The smudges and the pressing were ours alone to hold in memory. The drive away was long, winding back to paved roads and civilization. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting the cottage to recede in mist or shadow, but it stayed fixed, unchanging, silent. The lock reflected clouds, the hills curved away, and yet the image of those hand-shaped smudges stayed in my mind. I couldn't explain them. I couldn't justify them with animals or wind or branches. The pressing had been deliberate, methodical, human in form, but no one had been there. Weeks later, I looked at the photos I had taken of the cottage and the lock. The smudges were faint but visible in one corner, just enough to confirm that the memory had not misled me. I never returned to that area. I avoided isolated rentals with stone walls or distant landscapes. The impression of that night, the silence so complete it pressed against your ears, the methodical testing of the outer wall, and the hand-shaped smudges remained vivid and real. The ending is clear. We left. Nothing followed. The cottage remained isolated, in contact with no one, holding its quiet. The presence that had pressed against the stones retreated when challenged, leaving only smudges as evidence. No confrontation, no further signs, just memory, precise and undeniable. The isolation we sought, the silence we craved, and the reminder that human attention, deliberate and patient, can make even the quietest place feel observed. I rented the room out of necessity. My car had overheated on a stretch of highway late in the afternoon, the radiator smoking and the temperature gauge pinned against the red. I had no choice but to find somewhere nearby, and the Airbnb listing promised a simple room, cheap and close to the road. The host insisted that I use the back entrance, citing convenience, and I didn't think much of it at the time. The house was small, a single-story structure tucked behind a row of other buildings, quiet and unremarkable from the outside. The back door opened onto a narrow walkway between fences, and the handle felt cool under my hand. I followed the host's directions, unlocked the room, and stepped inside. The room itself was basic. A bed against one wall, a small dresser, and a desk with a single lamp. The lock was odd. It could only be engaged from the outside. Once inside, the door remained unlocked. That detail made me uneasy at first, but the exhaustion from the drive and the heat of the day pushed the thought aside. I unpacked minimally, laid out my clothes, and tried to relax. The air was warm, the light from the lamp casting corners of the room into shadow, but everything seemed ordinary. I noticed the personal items under the bed when I moved slightly to make space for my bag. A toothbrush, a small notebook, and a phone charger. None of them were mine. I checked around quickly, half expecting someone to pop out and explain, but the room was empty. The host had gone back to the main entrance, claiming he needed to handle some chores. I stared at the items for a moment, unsure whether to move them. I did, sliding my bag over to cover them. The thought that someone else had left their things there felt odd, but I told myself it was probably just a leftover from a previous guest. The night stretched on. Outside, the usual sounds of a suburban street were muted. Occasionally a car passed far away, headlights cutting across the curtains, but otherwise the silence was complete. I lay on the bed, reading on my phone with the lamp low, try to ignore the lingering anxiety about the items under the bed. Around midnight, the air felt heavier, the silence sharper. Every creak of the floor outside the door made me startle slightly. The room itself felt ordinary, but my attention was heightened in ways I couldn't relax. Then at 1:12 a.m., it happened. The doorknob turned once. Not a shake, not a twist or multiple attempts, just a single, deliberate turn. My stomach froze. I held my breath. Whoever did it didn't try again. The handle returned to its original position, as though nothing had happened. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my phone. I just lay flat on the bed, staring at the corner of the ceiling, listening for any other sounds. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Every creak from the house outside amplified in my mind. I imagined all the possibilities. Someone curious, someone testing the lock, someone watching from the back entrance. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed on the bed, lights on, listening to the subtle hum of the refrigerator from the next room and the occasional muffled sound of movement outside. Every time a shadow shifted past the window or a floorboard groaned, my pulse jumped. I kept glancing at the area under the bed, the personal items half hidden, a reminder that someone had been here before me, and possibly was still nearby. Time slowed to increments of fear, minutes stretching into what felt like hours. The silence outside became almost impossible to bear, the lack of other noises making every tiny sound inside the house resonate. Morning arrived pale and quiet. The sun had begun to seep through the curtains, illuminating the room in a soft gray light. I packed quickly, taking only my essentials, careful not to disturb the objects under the bed more than necessary. The house was still. No one appeared. The back entrance, which the host had insisted I use, remained closed, locked from outside as it should have been. I left without checking anything further. The street outside had begun to fill with the usual sounds of the day. Distant engines, footsteps on the sidewalk, the faint rustle of leaves. The normalcy of the morning made the night feel more unreal, but I knew exactly what had happened. I never checked my bank statement. I didn't know if the host had access through some account or if he had managed to get information during my stay. I didn't want to know. The presence of the personal items, the deliberate turn of the doorknob, and the way the room's design allowed someone to enter only from the outside created a situation that didn't require explanation. The horror of it was precise and minimal. Just the knowledge that someone had been able to interact with my space without my knowledge, without confrontation, and had chosen not to. That lack of action made it worse than an intrusion. It suggested patience, observation, and control. I drove away slowly, car overheating resolved, but the memory still hot in my mind. Every stoplight, every reflection in the rearview mirror reminded me of the night. There was no chase, no damage, no theft beyond unease, but the effect was undeniable. I replayed the single twist of the doorknob over and over, timing in my mind, imagining the person standing outside, waiting and testing, then leaving without effort. Weeks later, I remembered the items under the bed, the toothbrush, the notebook, and the charger still neatly placed as if waiting. The thought of them, mundane and ordinary objects, became more unsettling over time. Someone had been here. Someone had engaged with my room in ways I couldn't control or predict. It was entirely human, entirely real, and entirely precise. The ending is simple and complete. I left. Nothing followed. No confrontation, no explanation, no further interaction. I survived the night without incident, but the memory of that single turn of the doorknob and the presence it implied remained with me. The Airbnb, the back entrance, and the personal items under the bed became a lesson in subtle intrusion and the unnerving power of control without confrontation. It was a precise, silent, and wholly human experience of fear that didn't need escalation to be real.